In today's gospel reading, our Lord says, those who want to become his followers must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow him. So the embracing of the cross, embracing difficulties, the challenges of everyday life, we tend to complain instead of accepting these crosses that we cannot avoid. And when it comes to denying ourselves, basically, the term we use for that is mortification, and it comes from the Latin, which means to make dead. So basically denying yourself to make it so that part of you dies. And, if you're not someone who's familiar with this kind of terminology, somebody might say, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to deny yourself? And you see, the reason is, as St. Paul points out in today's second reading to the letter from his letter to the Corinthians, that we are like clay vessels, and what is within those vessels is something precious, our soul, which will exist for all eternity. But these vessels are weak, and we need the strength of God to help us. But the unfortunate thing is that we tend to give in to our passions. We tend to give in to our selfish desires. So when we deny ourselves, when we die to ourselves, we're only dying to a part of ourselves. It's that sinful, sensual part of us, the worldly part, the part of us that desires sinful things. So we want to avoid those things. So we practice mortification, and mortification is practicing self-denial, such as fasting, or maybe praying in a kneeling position when we may not find it comfortable, or just not eating between meals, or not eating as much, or just not eating certain foods, trying to eat more healthy. All of these are different ways of mortifying ourselves, denying ourselves. And there's so much benefit to this. We gain self-mastery, we gain self-control. And the problem is that whenever we're attached to our passions, we tend to give in to them. We lack that self-control, and so we're not free to be at the service of others. We lack that self-control. So once we're able to die to our passions, once we have this greater self-mastery, then we're capable of giving ourselves for the sake of others. Now today we celebrate the feast of the North American martyrs, St. John the Brebeuf, and the others, his companions. There's 8 of them. 6 of them were priests, 2 of them were laymen. Actually, they were all religious. They were all members of the Jesuits. And they had come to Canada to share the faith with the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And to do this entailed a sacrifice. In other words, they left the comforts of Europe at that time. Now, this was these individuals were martyred between the years 1642 and 1649. And we might think, oh, back then, back in Europe, things were pretty primitive. Well, that's true, but they had a lot of comforts. They had, indoor heating. They had, a fireplace and metal stoves and things like that. But here in North America, you've got the mosquitoes, you've got the black flies, and you don't have the same kind of construction material. So you have log houses, log cabins, and it doesn't hold the heat very well. So all kinds of hardships here, and just the extremes of the weather. But they also had to learn a new language. They had to be able to communicate with the people who originally lived here. And so all kinds of challenges, different food and having to hunt and things like that. So they sacrificed themselves, they gave of themselves for the sake of the native peoples of Canada. And they were fairly successful with the Huron Indians, but there was another band, the Iroquois. And the Iroquois were more warrior type of a group, and they were opposed to the white men. They were also opposed to the Hurons. And at one point, they wanted to exterminate the Hurons and the white men, taking some of the Hurons as captives and enslaving them also. So they set about, attacking one settlement after another, where the white men had made settlements and lived with the Huron Indians. And news of this spread. So people knew. They knew that it was just a matter of time. They were going to come and attack their settlement. So Jean de Brebeuf, he knew they were coming, but he stayed behind to to continue baptizing the catechumens who were preparing to become Catholic, but also to show his moral support. And when the Iroquois arrived, they captured Jean de Brebeuf, and they had heard of him, so they knew of him, and they knew that he was a very holy man. He was esteemed by the Indians because he was very strong, and he was a great, great spiritual leader. So when they captured him, they delighted, and they wanted to make an example of him to deter, to get all the other Huron Indians and all the Indians not to listen to the white men. So they wanted to torture him like severely. So this was in April. Snow was still on the ground. It was quite cold. They stripped him, and they were going to force him to return to their camp. But before they did, they stuck something very sharp under his nails and plucked out his fingernails as well as his toenails. So they forced him to march back to their camp. And once there, he had to run the gauntlet. So the gauntlet is you got 2 rows of people, each one with a club or some sharp object, and he has to run through, and as he runs through, each one takes a strike at him, at different parts of his body. So at the end of it, he's covered in bruises and in sores, scrapes and cuts, and they then tied him to a pole, and they began a very slow and prolonged torture. They wanted to make it last. They wanted to make him suffer as much as they could. So one individual just stabbed him a few times, with a sharp object, and of course that's going to cause a lot of pain. At one point they took some bark and wrapped around him and lit it on fire, so parts of him, suffered the burning. And at one point they actually cut pieces of his thighs off and roasted it and ate it in front of him. They scalped him, and they boiled water and poured it over his head 3 times in mockery of baptism. They took axe heads and they put it into hot coals and got them red hot and strung it around with some vine and put it around his neck. During this time, most people would be screaming in pain and agony, but he was not. Why is it that he was not? Well, as St. Paul says, we are in earthen vessels and we need the grace of Christ. So God helps us in our sufferings when we are close to God. So Christ was with St. Jean de Brebeuf. Christ was suffering with him and helping him in his sufferings, but he was filled with the same kind of love that Christ had. And so he had the attitude that Christ has on the cross. And so during his torture, he continued to look at his tormentors with love and to preach to them. And this infuriated them even more, so eventually they cut out his tongue, cut off his lips, and stuffed his mouth so that he would no longer be able to speak. But he continued to look at them with love. And the final act of their torture was that they cut open his chest and plucked out his still beating heart and ate it, because they desired to capture his spirit. They were so impressed by his heroism, by his ability to endure all this torture. So they were really, really impressed by him. And we too should be very impressed by him. And not just him, but all the other martyrs. Each one has their own story of their martyrdom. Some of them were fairly quick, but some of them were also slow and they kind of dragged it out. But St. Jean de Brebeuf, as I mentioned, he was this great, great spiritual leader. And so he was a great spiritual leader while he lived, but also in his death. And these North American martyrs, they are the secondary patrons of Canada. In other words, they were willing to suffer these things for the sake of the peoples, the native peoples of this land. And what tremendous love they had. And we too should try to imitate that love. We too should be willing to sacrifice ourselves, to endure a certain amount of suffering, to embrace a certain amount of crosses for the sake of sharing the faith with others. Now notice our Lord in today's gospel reading, he says, "Those who are ashamed of me and of my words, Of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Some people are ashamed. Some people are embarrassed to manifest their faith publicly because somebody might look at them the wrong way or call them a name. It's like we're afraid of this tiny little suffering. Compare that to the suffering of Jean de Brebeuf. Now, we have an account of his martyrdom because some of the Hurons that were captured along with him, they were made slaves of the Iroquois, but some of them were able to escape, and they related what happened. And the accounts of their martyrdom are related in the Jesuit relations, so the people who were here wrote back to France, and they have records of these things. So it's wonderful to have this tremendous testimony, this tremendous witness, not just to our faith, but to the tremendous love that these Jesuit martyrs had for the native peoples of Canada. And we need to have this love for everyone. Let us do what we can to imitate them, and let us not be ashamed of our faith. As I mentioned, sometimes with the life chain, sometimes people don't come out because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed, they're worried somebody they know might see them standing holding a sign that abortion kills children. So just a reminder, we have our life chain this coming Sunday from 2 to 3 p.m. Hopefully you can join us. We'll be there, rain or shine. We're going to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of the truth, for the sake of defending innocent life, and for the sake of defending men and women. Just recently there was an article that a woman died during the procedure of abortion at a very high level clinic. So to say that abortions are safe is totally false, totally wrong. Most women have some complications, either physical or definitely psychological. So there's no such thing as a safe abortion. Just a reminder, we will have a funeral tomorrow at 12 noon for Anthony Roberts Saldana, and may his soul and the souls of all the faithful departed through the mercy of God rest in peace. Amen.